Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunstreet. Dunstreet is a modern campaign agency dedicated to using data-driven grassroots organising to build winning campaigns and make the world a better place. Whether you're in business, issue-based campaigns, or an organisation driving change in your local community, Dunstreet develops strategies to overcome those challenges by connecting people that share the same values and working towards a common goal. So if you want to partner with Dunstreet to help change the world, hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Hello, my name is Stephen Donnelly and welcome to Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that will dive into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. Today's episode is done in conjunction with the Chifley Research Centre, which is the think tank for the Australian Labor Party, and it was recorded live at the Chifley Research Centre's Policy Conference towards 2022, which was held in Sydney, New South Wales over the weekend. This particular session from the conference that you're going to hear today as a part of our podcast series was titled, Is Labor Losing the Working Class? How do social democratic parties reconcile the demands of workers and progressives in the modern world? And this panel that led this discussion was moderated by Ed Husic, who's Labor's member for Chifley and great-grandfather of first-time podcaster Sabina Husic, who was on the show way back before the federal election. Rebecca White, who is the Labor leader of the opposition in Tasmania, Michelle Myers, the ALP National Vice President, and Nick Rees from Melbourne Uni, and is also a Melbourne City Councillor. It was a very interesting conversation. The audio is a little bit different to how it normally sounds for these podcasts because it was done in a rather large room, so it sounds like it is in a rather large room. But you also get to hear the questions and answers that were at the end of the facilitated conversation as well. So it's kind of interesting to hear from the people that actually attended and participated in what was a really engaging conference run by Chifley over the weekend. So if you weren't there, and you missed out, what we do hope to do over the next couple of weeks is to punch out some of those sessions on Socially Democratic. So you get to hear about some of the great conversations that were had by many people who were participating in those sessions. Don't forget the podcast is now available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. So if you're listening to Socially Democratic for the very first time, please make sure you subscribe to Socially Democratic via whatever podcast app you listen to. If you listen to it on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating, 5 stars obviously, and give us a review. Because the more ratings and reviews we get, then we get bumped up the charts, which helps then obviously promote the podcast to a lot more people who are across the progressive side of politics. Don't forget also that you can follow us on all of our various social media platforms. Follow Dunstreet on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. So let's get to this week's episode and I'll hand it over to Ed Husic.
Okay, we're going to kick off. I've got a few more people coming in. Thank you so much for turning up today to this session, which I think for a lot of us in this room, some of the questions that are being posed about how we manage the issues, particularly from the respect of a progressive party that's trying to ensure it represents as many people and many interests as possible, that we manage that. I'm Ed Husic. I'm the federal member for Chifley. I'll introduce all our guests in a moment, but if I can start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay respects to elders past and present. I also wanted to start with a question that probably a lot of us had on May 18, and that was, what just happened? At its most superficial level, we did go through this experience where high expectation was not met. The idea that we would go ahead and succeed and then be able to enact a process or an agenda of change didn't occur. But there was also something else happening. And as we were watching those results come in, this sort of political scaling, stronger support in the south of the country or in parts of the south of the country, weakening to the north, stronger supports in the east that weakened to west, areas that usually vote Liberal prepared to vote Labor, and areas that usually would vote Labor actually doing the opposite. And it's obviously something that has forced people, particularly within our party, to think a lot more deeply. And in doing so, recognising some cross-currents that are out there in the broader community across the nation that are posing challenges for us. On the one hand, we've got, in many respects, concerns about, for instance, the level of debt that households are carrying, the fact that wages aren't growing or the type of work to help service those debts, that work isn't as secure as people would expect. We have businesses prepared not to pay tax or even pay higher wages, yet at the same time looking after quite neatly senior executives and their pay packets and shareholders. And as a Labor politician, post-election, is that the type of language that I'm supposed to be engaged in, and where's the balance between cajoling and cooperating? We also have other cross-currents occurring where, for example, in the online world, what you want to get comes easily, everything is convenient. If you're not happy with it, you return it and you move on. What does that do in terms of shaping people's views about fighting for the things that they think are important? Are we prepared to actually fight for change in the way that we'd seen previous generations do? Are we willing to take the cost in an environment where people are worried that in one instance they know their wages aren't going up, but they're worried as well about whether or not they can actually take a stand, concerned that they might lose a job and not be able to do the things that they need? For a progressive party like ours, or a workers' party as ours, where at its very heart we try to champion change, how do we do that in that type of environment? It's something I think a lot about, but haven't necessarily got the answers. That's why we've organised these great people here today to help answer the difficult question: if business is outsourced, why can't I? So we have some great guests that are going to join us today, and I'll start by introducing them. We've got the Leader of the Opposition in Tasmania, Rebecca White. We have the National Vice President of the ALP and the National Official of the Maritime Division of the CFMEU, Michelle Myers. And we also have with us Nick Rees, who's the Nicholas Rees, I should say more formally, because I'm about to introduce you as the Principal Fellow of the University of Melbourne, but also a councillor on the City of Melbourne. Welcome. And before I throw it to questions, I've been asked to read this very important announcement, which is going to sound very ominous, but it's not that bad. Today's session is a recorded episode of Socially Democratic, a great podcast, and it's the official podcast of the Toward 2022 conference. Socially Democratic is your weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that dives into the progressive issues of the day and people leading them from home and abroad. Subscribe to Socially Democratic on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher, and your favourite podcast app, written and authorised by Ed Husic. Is that what I say at the end of that? Righto, thank you. I might start, Rebecca, throwing the first tough question to you. Some of those things that I was reflecting on at the opener, and the challenge of being able to reconcile between progressive agendas and the rights of working people in this country that sometimes might be at variance. You'd probably feel that in many respects in your state. How is that challenge being thought through from a Tasmanian Labor perspective?
Thanks, Ed, and hi everybody. Tasmania is a fairly unique state, given that we are, I think, more so than not a Labor state, but we've seen a Liberal government in power now since 2014, and we lost 2 seats at the recent federal election as well. So it's an interesting time for us. There's been, I think, a massive shift across the Australian landscape since the Whitlam era, when free higher education was provided for people and people pursued their aspirations of higher education. We saw a much more educated Australian person come into our voting conscience, and we've got a sort of working class who are traditional Labor people, but then a bunch of those people's children went on and got higher education qualifications, who today I think are probably choosing how they might vote. They might vote Green or they might vote Liberal, and they're not naturally coming back to Labor, which is where you would hope they might come. And I think we've been a victim of our own success to a degree when you think back on previous policies that have helped lift people out of poverty and pursue their aspirations. So how do we provide, as a party, hope for them and provide them with comfort that their economic security is going to be maintained? Because I think for a lot of working class people, that's something that they feel a little concerned by, whether rightly or wrongly, and probably a lot of it's driven by fear campaigns that the Liberal parties help to propagate. So we need to make sure that people feel their economic security can be maintained, but also continue to be a party of progressives who can deal with some of the very complex challenges that are facing our nation and our world, and obviously climate change is a big one. And in Tasmania, it has been quite a challenge to bridge that gap. We've seen a big shift away from the Labor Party in working class suburbs over the last 13 years, which was the last time we won majority government in Tasmania. So the polling data doesn't lie. It shows us that we've had a decline of up to 20% in some of those areas. And at the same time, we haven't had a commensurate increase in some of the progressive areas. So we aren't making up enough ground in those communities. And I think primarily it's because of people's primary concern about economic security. And as the party of working people, we should be able to talk to that particular concern much better than the Liberal Party. And I think that comes back to dealing with issues around skills and training, education, essential services that support people to have a good quality of life, and also look at how we're measuring things, whether GDP or gross state product in the Tasmanian sense is the best way to do that. And the work that the New Zealand government's been doing around the wellbeing budget's of particular interest to us, because we need to think about how we measure quality of life for people, access to healthcare, housing, whether or not the planet is going to be able to continue to sustain the way that we live. So I feel that we can do this, and we can do it in a way that's true to our values, but that reassures people that their economic security is not going to be undermined, that we can provide a pathway to employment for people through good skills and training, and that we can lift people out of poverty. In Tasmania, 1 in 4 people lives in poverty, and yet our economy at the moment is ranked number 1 in the country. So it's a massive mismatch between the lives that people are living and the rhetoric that their government's telling them. And that's the challenge for the Labor Party in Tasmania, is to be able to provide hope to those people, make sure that their economic security is protected, but also lift them out of poverty by doing things that the Labor Party has been inherently very good at, and that's investing in essential public services like health and education and housing. And we can also do that by providing jobs for people, because all of those things require things to be built or services to be delivered, and that requires us to align our training pathways with the work that is available. So for me, our primary task is to articulate that very clearly as a party in Tasmania, talk about hope for the future and hope for people's children, talking about the services that people depend upon and the infrastructure that supports them to live a good quality of life, jobs that are required for us to be able to deliver that for Tasmanians, and at the same time tackle some of those big complex problems like changing climate and what that means for our industries and how we help it just transition. I think only the Labor Party is serious about tackling all of these things, and sometimes it means that we can get caught up in the policy narrative rather than the politics, and I fear that that's sometimes been our downfall, that we're too busy thinking about these complex challenges and trying to articulate complex solutions to them, and our opponents take a very simple narrative, run a fear campaign, undermine any good work that we've done, and at the end of the day, our community is no further advanced.
So picking up on one of those points that you raised before I throw over to Nick, the issue of inequality and materially improving the lives of people, particularly in your state, in an environment where, again, going back to that issue about wages not growing so much, do you think the expectation ramps up on governments that they fill the gap to actually help out families that are doing it tough And how do you do it in some states where,
Yeah.
particularly that are under financial pressure, like Tasmania? How do you, how is that achieved? That's a massive challenge. How do you think that gets done?
Yeah, it's a massive challenge. Currently, what's happening in Tasmania is the state government relies on charities to fill that gap. And what we've seen even just yesterday, ironically, is the federal government's changed the way it funds emergency relief providers. And one of the biggest ones in Tasmania wasn't funded because it's not a national organisation. So as of yesterday, it shut its doors. So 70,000 people who rely on that particular provider won't have access to food, and we're in weeks leading up to Christmas. So the government's relied on charities rather than thinking about how it supports people and lifts them out of poverty. And I think that's where the Labor Party can do it differently. And I've looked at what has been discussed. We had the presentation earlier about the Green New Deal, and there are elements of that which I think are very important for us in Tasmania. I wouldn't categorise it in that way, but thinking about where are the jobs of tomorrow, what does the future of work look like, how do we help people to transition to that, but meet people halfway so you don't scare them. And I fear that that's where we have a disconnect between what we envisage for our future and how we think we can get there. But people are so busy trying to make ends meet right now that any change is absolutely terrifying for them. So we have to be able to assist with that in a way that isn't too fast for people. So help with the adjustment. But I think also frame it up through a jobs paradigm, as opposed to you're going to lose all of these industries, and that's important that you make that sacrifice for the well-being of the planet. That's not going to help people make that transition. We need to make a very clear pathway to alternative employment, and there are lots of new jobs we could be training people for. That's where the state has a role, working with TAFE to provide training pathways, working with our schools to provide training pathways, or retraining current employment people in current employment in industries that are in transition. And also thinking about how we intervene sooner, whether it be dealing with some of those issues around poverty, working with our young people, particularly in the early years. We know that the first 1,000 days are so critical for the well-being of somebody as they progress through into their adult life. The Labor Party's been the only party that's ever taken the social determinants of health seriously. The Liberals and the Conservatives flat out deny that they even matter. And they're the things that we have to be able to communicate clearly to people, because unless we do that, we'll just continue to react. It'll be crisis after crisis. That's very expensive, but also awful for people as it impacts on them and their quality of life. So it'll take time. We have to be sensitive in how we help transition people in industries. And we also need to realise that will require money up front to do that. But it's better than the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff.
Totally. So picking up on some of those points that Rebecca has raised, Nick, we had in a federal election, you had Labor with very solid policy platforms and ideas on health, on education, some of the other areas, particularly where people may be worried about the quality of their work, the impact of contracting, and particularly labour contracting. We had a stack of different ideas that were out there up against a coalition that really had maybe a sketch of one policy and a whole team that hid behind one person. They won, and the question is there an issue of having too broad an agenda or too focused an agenda? When you look at you sort of scan what's happened here, or you look at other parts of the world, is it that social democratic parties are too ambitious and have too big an agenda, or can something solid, a solid range of policy proposals, particularly picking up on some of the issues that Rebecca outlined, those challenges, has someone found a way to make that work?
Look, it's a great question, Ed. Look, I probably share the view of the review of the federal Labor's federal campaign that found that Labor had a very cluttered policy agenda. I mean, I think the policy agenda was terrific, but there was a lot of policies in there, and so that meant there was a lot to attack. But it also meant I also felt that there wasn't a single grand idea or two or three big ideas that people could get their heads around and say, yes, that's why I'm going to vote Labor. Very interestingly, and I think this is where your question was going, I had the opportunity to travel to Denmark last month, and whereas we lost a federal election here in May, the Social Democrats won their national election in Denmark, won back government in June. So we lost in May, they won in June. So I met with Jan Juul Christensen, the General Secretary, a lot of his officers, got to meet with Mette Frederiksen, now the Prime Minister of Denmark, and my basic question was, how did you do it? How did you win when we lost? And there was a couple of aspects to it, but the idea of a grand idea was a very big one. Now, some of what I'm going to say is probably not going to be welcomed by people here.
Well, that's why we're here.
And some of it was not comfortable listening for me, but I'm going to say it anyway, okay? So the first thing they did was they got sick of losing elections on immigration. Right, so every election, the Conservatives would go out and say they're weak on immigration. We know all the lines that get run about progressive political parties on this stuff. So they took a very strict line on immigration. They still put some policies out there to prove that they had a much more humane approach to these issues. So they were going to increase funding for UN processing facilities in the Middle East and Africa and so on. But the truth is they adopted a very hardcore immigration policy. Then, and their analysis was, okay, now the electorate is listening to us again. The second thing they did is they said, we're going to make Denmark a green superpower again. So they talked about the environment and sort of a green transition, but they did it very much in what we would describe as social democratic or Labour terms. So Mette Frederiksen, now the Prime Minister of Denmark, she said, I'm a social democrat first and a green second. For me, we cannot have environmental justice without social and economic justice as well. So what did that mean they did? They said, we know that the Danes, everybody around the world knows that the Danes build windmills and wind farms. So they went and promised 3 massive new offshore wind farms that were going to generate thousands of new manufacturing jobs, and those manufacturing jobs were going to be located in regional areas. Contrast that to Labor's very admirable environmental policies here in Australia, but when we started getting carpet bombed on what that was going to mean for regional jobs in Australia, I would put it to you that we didn't have a particularly great comeback. Whereas in Denmark, it was all about, they totally reframed the environmental debate around the thousands of jobs that they were going to create through renewable power, through wind farms, making them, and they wrapped it up in nationalistic terms as well, making them a green superpower. The third major plank of their policy or plan was their grand idea, if you like, and that's how they describe this was their grand idea, was around retirement policy and a retirement plan for Denmark. So while the Conservatives in Denmark were talking about people having to work longer, work till they were 70, I don't know if this sounds familiar to any people in this room, they went out and said, you know what, if people work hard enough, and no Dane should have to work for more than 40 years. So the genius of this policy was that if you're a university graduate going into the professions, and let's say you don't start work until you're in your late 20s or 30s, well, you're going to work till 70. But if you maybe do a trade or do some sort of occupation where you use your body, you might be starting work at 18. You're going to retire at 58. So professionals, progressives, dare I say, they didn't mind. They were fine with that policy, thought it was good. Working people in Denmark, they loved it. and they came across to their party in droves. And so the net result at the end of the election was they did lose votes in some of the inner city parts in the 2 major cities in Denmark, but they more than made that up in regional areas with working class voters, and they're now governing in Denmark.
I don't expect you to be a spokesperson for the Danish Social Democratic Party and talking about all their policy, but in terms of that policy that you just outlined, which I think would get a lot of people interested, what was the sort of game plan on retirement income? What's their approach? They have a state-based pension or similar sort of superannuation arrangements as us? And because the obvious question would be, well, how's it get paid for?
Yeah.
Which always seems to emerge whenever you're putting forward policy, I suppose, in any election, really.
So the broader context in which that policy was being announced was Denmark, like many countries in Europe, has had many years of austerity. People are sick of it. And so they were able, for the first time, if you like, to go forward with a policy that talked about a more generous welfare state and a more generous pension system. I should say this is a policy that's not without complications in terms of implementation. Also, it was accompanied by a policy around what they called flex work, so this idea that people in certain professions, when they get to certain stages of their career, particularly more advanced years, that they could work part-time, and so they could go through a period of their working life where there was they were working part-time, but they were getting a state pension of sorts as well. There were higher taxes that were going to fund this. They increased the death duties, which were already in place in Denmark. I mean, this is political kryptonite in Australia, some of this stuff, but the Danes...
Yeah, I saw the Facebook campaign.
Yeah, you did. The Danes have a death duty, as many countries in the OECD do. They proposed to lift that on estates worth more than 2 million Australian dollars, I think it was, or maybe $3 million. So essentially that was wealthier Danes paying higher taxes to fund some of these new social welfare measures. And they're pretty open about that.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick. Now, I'm going to be asking a few questions here of Michelle, but just to give you a heads up, if there are people that want to ask questions of the panellists, get your questions ready because we'll try and open up. We need to finish the panel at 11:20 so people have an opportunity to ask questions if they'd like. Michelle, as both a national vice president of a political party in the Labor Party, but also a national official of a major union, this is probably the things that we're talking about here right now are probably things you're thinking about on a daily basis. So the question I was going to pose is, in terms of, well, particularly for a union where you're having to always make the case for change and to try and get people on board to do that within a membership, is it? Let me put the question this way: is there any heart to fight for change anymore? Do people just expect it to be handed, or how is it? What is the way in which we will drive change to improve people's lives?
I guess that's a great question. I think, in my industry, so I'm from the Maritime Union Division of the CFMEU, we have been absolutely decimated by the current Liberal government, and our members, they've been fighters forever, and they are social change fighters as well. They always have stood up for social justice and not just, their working conditions. The members in my union are always prepared to fight for what is right, whether it's in the community or whether it's their workplace. But what we've seen through the Liberal government, I've been on picket lines with our seafarers have been ripped off ships in the middle of the night and left on the wharf and been replaced by an exploited foreign crew, getting paid as little as $2 an hour. So under this Liberal government, there's been 15 Australian crewed ships gone off the coast. So our seafarers think our industry is gone because of this government. So they're willing to fight for a new one because they need hope, and we've got to get rid of this. We're going to turn fear into hope. People that still voted for the Liberals this time thought, I'm scared because they're good economic managers or whatever rubbish that was being spun to them. But, they voted for them because they were afraid of, their money going somewhere or, something going to happen to their lot in life. We've got to make sure that the working class and the unemployed and retirees know that we're on their side. Because that is our principles. That's what we believe in. We want to make sure that, and we need to, communicate that across and fight the Facebook campaigns and the rubbish that's spun by the others. Because we are the party that is that cares for you if you're unemployed and cares for you if you're in work, and we'll make sure you've got a good, decent retirement. We have to ensure that we are clearly articulating those messages that we are going to make sure that there are jobs and there are good jobs and that people can get a job. and you can retire without waiting till 70 and everything's broken and you die for 5 weeks after your retirement. I mean, that's just ridiculous, especially in the industries that I work in. We work hard. It's manual labour. When we're talking about the green jobs, we've been pushing for a wind farm, an offshore wind farm down in Victoria. It's in Gippsland, it's regional jobs. It took the government 4 years just to approve an exploratory licence for them to go and see if it was viable to put a wind farm out in the ocean. Like, why are we stopping? Why are there barriers to these potential new energies and new jobs? And there is thousands of jobs in offshore wind in the Gippsland region. There's manufacturing, it's shipping, it's building the things, it's maintaining them, and these are skilled trade jobs that we are short of, and we need to make sure that we push for these new projects, or at least allow them to go and see if it's possible to do these new projects. 4 years sitting on an exploratory licence is just absurd. Let's go and see if it's possible for a start. But the government won't even do that.
And what about the... I was just going to ask about, obviously a lot more aware of issues like, for example, underemployment, where people feel like they're not getting the hours that they really need, or that the type of work, part-time versus a full-time secure job, the number of people worried about that has reached record levels. The amount that people are getting paid in terms of increase in wages is probably flatlined. Yet people know this is an issue. Are they prepared to fight for it? How do you create an agenda that allows to an improved bargaining position for working Australians, while also reassuring them that they can hold on to the jobs that they have as a result?
We need to change the system. The ability for workers to fight for anything at the moment is obviously, just constricted by the legislation that is in place. You're not allowed to take industrial action. You're not allowed to, we're not allowed to walk off the job on the wharves because of the Sydney smoke. They threatened 300 workers out there the other night to sack them all because they couldn't work in the smoke. And people are going, they're working air conditioning. They weren't. They're on deck out there. You've got ash landing on you and you can't breathe. These are the seafarers and wharfies, and we've got 3 big multinational companies wanting to sack the whole workforce because they can't work if they can't breathe. Our workers will fight for that stuff, but we need to make sure. Our seafarers now, I manage a database, and there's 1,000 seafarers on there that have been out of work for more than a year. Every Monday they have to reply to me to say they're still available for work. And the things they write back are just heartbreaking. This is all they've known, the job they've done for 20 years or 5 years or, 40 years, some of them. And they have, when are we going to get a chance to have a job? And who's going to fight for that, and what does that look like? Our building, we're in Sydney, our national office. I come out the front of the building and there's 25 bikes there lined up for the Deliveroo and those the insecure, they're absolutely exploited workers. And people from my industry are now driving Ubers or, going out to do delivery work because they can't get a job in their own industry anymore. We have to make sure if that's the only job we can get on a moped going delivering food, we've got to make sure they're protected. They've got to get decent wages and be insured and have protections in place. It's a big job. It's a big task ahead. But, we're the party for that. And we're just going to make sure we bring everyone along for the ride and understand, listen to them, go and sit with them. If you're doing nothing, Saturday afternoon, go out to the wharves and sit in the smoko room and talk to the workers. They will tell you what's going on. Yeah. And they'll tell you they're ready to fight for it because we're fighters.
Thank you. A question I wanted to put to the entire panel, and it's a bit of a tricky one. The whole notion of these culture wars that are out there raging in the political landscape, how does Labor avoid being wedged in those culture wars? We can turn the cameras off so they don't record our secret plan. But I guess I'd just open that up to the panel. How do we, be it on climate change that you touched upon, and trying to make sure that we've got strong policies to respond, but also look after people that might be affected on the way through, or social issues as well. How do we actually find a way to navigate through that, and who wants to be the first person to answer or make a contribution on that?
I'm going to have a go. I think we know who we are. The Labor Party is a party that's founded on the values of fairness and equality and social justice. So I think every time these issues come up in the Parliament, I can only talk about it really from my perspective in Tasmania, and I've heard Albo talk about legislation as well. It's happening all over the place. We just have to make sure that we respond in a way that's true to our values and the people that we represent, and fundamentally that has to be working people. And it's very frustrating because, and I refer back to Whitlam again, in that he said only the impotent are pure. And the Greens always try and wedge us and have a position, particularly when it comes to the environment and on climate, that is a purist approach that doesn't think about people. We've moved amendments to motions to ensure it includes provisions for just transitions. They vote against it because they want action immediately, irrespective of the cost to the people who are working in those industries right now. And that is not who we are. So for me, every time these issues come up in the Parliament, whether it be state or federal, we have to maintain discipline with respect to who we are and representing the people that rely on Labor governments, because the Liberal Party won't look after them and the Greens are happy to forget about them.
Thank you. Who next? Sure.
I'm very happy to have I'll go on this one. Look, the starting observation I would make here is that the Australian electorate is highly fragmented. So even the premise for this whole discussion today about how does Labor win back the working class? Well, in Australia, 70% of people actually identify as middle class, and probably 20% of the electorate identifies as working class, and 10% identifies as upper class or whatever they call themselves. Now, if you think about that, that statistically can't be possible. But nonetheless, that's how Australians think about themselves. So if the Labor Party says, OK, we're going to win this election by being the party of the working class, we'll most certainly lose, because there's only 20% of the Australian people actually think about themselves in those terms. The truth is that it's a complex joint, right? Like there's Queenslanders, I put it to you, think quite differently about certain issues than Victorians, where I'm from. I represent an inner, the most latte, the highest latte consuming part of Australia, probably in inner city Melbourne there.
If it helps, it's creating jobs. So.
It is. Good jobs as well, dare I say. It drives me crazy when I see the Labor Party tear itself apart on some of these issues. I guess a couple of points I'd make is, don't forget, these issues are also difficult for the Liberal Party. Like if you go to a Liberal Party branch meeting, I'm sure you'd find, or you look amongst a Liberal Party lectures, you find opinions quite divided on something like gay marriage. You would find opinions quite divided on climate change as well amongst Liberals. I'd put it to you that there's division within the Liberal Party between small business and big business as well. So they've got their own fracture lines that they need to navigate. I think that the case study in how you manage these things is probably Daniel Andrews in Victoria. He is very progressive on certain social issues, but he also does very, very well in regional parts of Victoria and in what you would describe as traditional working class areas as well. Why does he do well in those?
I was going to ask you a question.
So why does he do well in those areas? Well, because he's got a fantastic program around improving schools. He's got a fantastic program about improving the health system. He's got a massive infrastructure agenda, which is out there selling brilliantly as well as getting on and doing it, and people really like it. So when most people go to vote in Victoria, the truth is they're not voting on Daniel Andrews' social agenda. They're actually voting on what he's doing for the health system, what he's doing for education system, this massive infrastructure program that he's got going that people love.
But he's got the basics right, hasn't he? So he's got the fundamentals right, which give him social licence to do those progressive things.
He's absolutely got the basics right. So if Labor's getting attacked on a particular wedge issue, the trick, I think, is change the conversation and move it on to something which actually is much more important to many more people, and make that the focus of the debate.
Michelle, you're not going to escape the question. What's your take?
Well, I was just thinking about, the people that I've come across in the last couple of days that are now considered the working class, and would, if they were doing a survey, would say so. Raj at my local service station pays the fine and doesn't go and vote because he just can't be bothered and thinks it's ridiculous. Dave in my street who works in a manufacturing warehouse who thinks we're all mad and he's not going to vote for anyone. They're the people we're talking about. These are the people that we need to make sure that they know that we're on their side. And it frustrates me, and it's hard to not be angry that people think like that, but they think nobody cares about them. And Raj in the servo, he just said, I never go and vote, I just pay the fine. I just went, come on, man, your vote counts here. This is about you. This and our party is about you, and it should be, and we need to make sure that those people know that we're there for them. So I think Daniel Andrews articulates that very well. I'm concerned about sometimes we make decisions that working people think are bad for them, moving ports and building new ones which could open up to automation. That's just, we need to be really careful how we think about the future of our infrastructure and all of that, to make sure that there's good jobs going into those places and things aren't going to be automated and you lose whole industries because of it.
I did say earlier that if people had questions, I'd be more than happy to. Excellent. As a moderator, you're always wondering, is someone going to have a question? So I'm going to start because you were so energetic in putting your hand up. So you go first. And
I want to pick up the point of policies versus politics, because I think at the heart of our problem, Labor's problem, is this narrative that we're bad economic managers and budget surplus is a good thing. And that's wrong. We need to actually spend money as a government to provide all the things that you're talking about. So how do you get around that? How do you change the narrative?
So the question, just for people down the back, is reconciling the difference between policy and politics and being able to navigate that. Who wants to answer? I'll hand it to you first.
Thanks. I mean, they say that politics gets in the way of good policy all the time. And that may be true. How do you reconcile that? I think that's a challenge that we're still trying to find an answer to be fair. Because for most of us in this room, we're here because we're engaged in policy and public policy and thinking about what the future looks like and how we get there. The political overlay of that is challenging, but I think that's where it requires us to be a bit sensitive, because we can think, because we're immersed in something, we've read something, we've watched something, we've heard the speeches today, we're already racing ahead in our mind. Well, I know I am thinking about, all right, what can we do to solve some of these challenges? So when I talk to people, I'm already 20 steps ahead of them. So I need to wind that back and think, all right, you don't know any of the stuff that I know. How do I convey this to you in a way that's not going to scare you and undermine the way that you feel or the job that you're doing, or make you feel like your job's at risk? So that's, I suppose, where the communication comes in, whether you call it politics or communication. For me, I think it's about how we talk to people in a way that helps explain what we're doing. So it's not even politics, it's communication, but understanding that the landscape is very diverse. Politics will always play a role because there are political parties in our system, in our democracy in Australia. So we have to think about how we can provide the contrast between us and what others are offering to demonstrate how we can deliver on those things. But we'll always use negative political ads to demonstrate that contrast, and I know they're unpopular, but they are effective. We'll always use, I would hope to engage anyway, the message of hope. It's, the politics of the future and how we can inspire people to want to vote for us. But unfortunately, I think the use of negative advertising in politics is here to stay. And whilst I would like to say we can all be a purist in this room and we won't engage in that, we'll run a different campaign, our opponents won't. And they will beat us because of that. So it's not a level playing field. We're not all operating in this environment with the same integrity. So we have to be able to communicate our ideas in a way that understands that landscape. And unfortunately, that means you need to use some of those tactics.
I'm just going to be a genial tyrant, if I may, and just have one person answer the question, because I know there's a lot of people in the room that want to ask questions. I noticed there was someone on this side, and then I'll come back to yourself, and I'm making a general list. You wanted to ask a question? Yes.
Yes. Going back to, I think Nick referred to this, but the definition or perceptions of what is working class, because certainly where I live in northwestern Sydney, there are a lot of people, certainly from the last federal campaign, working on pre-poll, etc. They are absolutely in insecure employment. They're in sham contract type positions. They're at the very bottom of the economic ladder, yet they've swallowed the Liberal Party narrative that's about opportunity and aspiration. And yet these people could lose their jobs next day, next week. They're very vulnerable. How then do we reframe that narrative so that they feel that the Labor Party is speaking to them in terms of policies that work for them, given that the Liberals will, of course, push the fear factor all the time?
Thank you. Nick?
Look, it's a great question. One of the ironies of the last federal election was the large numbers of people who seemingly voted against their economic interests, and nowhere is that more clearly illustrated in those electorates who were actually likely to be most affected by Labor's changes to superannuation. And Labor's changes to capital gains, actually Labor's vote went up, whereas in those electorates where people were going to benefit, not going to be affected by those tax changes, but were going to get all the goodies that flowed from Labor in terms of increased investment in social services, Labor's vote went down. So clear case of people voting against their economic interest. How do you get over the top of that? Well, I think, again, I go back to the Denmark case study that I talked of earlier, where they came back with, as they said in the Danish, the grand idea. So they had 2 or 3 big ideas that they went out to the electorate with. That dominated the public debate during the campaign. The more the Social Democrats got attacked about their retirement policy, and it was going to cost too much and this and that, the more they thought, great, we've just won another day of the campaign, because the more time people spend talking about this, the better, because we know that the people of Denmark, particularly working people of Denmark, really want this.
But Nick, if I can just jump in, so that point that you started with, the observation with respect to people voting against their own interests, this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, people were talking about this in US elections when George W. was running. Is there something, where's the balance? Again, coming back to the earlier question that was asked, finding that way to balance the policy and the politics as well. I might get you, if you could, to jump in on that. In trying to deal with that, is the answer simply narrowing the number of ideas that are being put, or the way in which the ideas are being put?
Look, I think communication, as Beck touched on, is an important part of it. Also, the way the arguments are put, framing them in a way which appeals to people. Again, the Danish case study, when they talked about environmental policy, they very much framed it in terms of a jobs policy and an economic opportunity for Denmark. When they talked about let's make Denmark a green superpower again, it almost had a sort of Trumpian flourish to it, because they were appealing to like national pride and wrapped it up in a bit of Danish nationalism as well. So look, I do think framing is important. The earlier question about, Labor often finds itself getting tied in knots around these culture war debates. The solution is to find something else, talk about that and cut through. Daniel Andrews, you might agree with, safe injecting rooms, you might agree with, or not agree with his, very progressive social policy rules, but for most people, they're not voting on that. They're voting on schools, hospitals, infrastructure, and that's then he was able to make that the dominant issues in the campaign, not these other, I was going to say silly, but I don't want to demean the importance of these social debates, but he was able to move the agenda onto things that work much more squarely and better for him politically.
Now, before I ask you to ask your question, can people just put their hand up so I can remember? That was here. Okay, I'm going to take a photo of the room. I'm going to try and balance it out on either side of the room as well. So we're going to go here, and then I'll come to you next. And somehow I'll manage.
Before the last election, the branch I'm in put up a motion to say the the federal executive got to address the economic issue. The fact that Liberals are better economic managers is the only thing that won the election, apart from we had a leader that people didn't want. Okay, that's the other elephant in the room. We had a leader we didn't want. We didn't vote for them, that leader. Back in 2013, I was at the National Conference in Melbourne, and we voted 60-40 for Albanese, and the executive voted 60-40. Somehow they're smarter than us. Well, they're not. Okay, so they need to be listening to us in regards to strategy for the next election. Where is the session on strategy for the next election? We're going to have issue after issue after issue. We're going to talk through our hats on issues. We need a strategy for the next election, and we need to tell you what that is.
Now, if you can attach something with a question mark at the end of it, would make my job a hell of a lot easier.
So what do you think of that idea?
Okay, Michelle, over to you.
That's my question. How did that work out? I think probably, we need to listen to the rank and file members of the party. You know, that's what it's about. I mean, that's where, why join the Labor Party if we can't participate? We need to make sure that our rank and file members have the ability to participate, to have their voice heard, and to be seen and to be part of the process. So obviously, like you're saying, there's no session here on that. I didn't write the agenda; it's not my fault. But
You are in New South Wales.
Yeah, sorry. I am from New South Wales. But the whole point is, like, if you're going to a branch meeting and putting resolutions up, where are they going to? Are they getting heard, and are we making sure of that? I wasn't asking you a question. Sorry, I was responding to yours. I was just, but we need to make sure that if branch members go to a meeting on Monday night in the middle of winter, their voices are heard. So that's part of our process that we need to ensure happens from now.
I guess, well, being one of the two politicians in the table here, picking up on your point about where's the strategy and when are we thinking about it, I think these type of sessions actually fundamentally require us to think carefully. Like the very session itself is in part trying to get the answers to help shape strategy into the future, but importantly coming out of, and obviously what I've picked up from the points that you've raised, is the whole issue of engaging with the rank and file. But again, the challenge has been there'd be a lot of policies that we put forward at the last election a lot of people in this room would have agreed with, but it still wasn't the special formula that got us to the place where we could bring in change. But again, well, I'll look forward to talking with you later on. But I think the point is absolutely well made about thinking ahead in terms of strategy. So I'm going to go here, down the back, and I know you've been very patient, and there's a lot of people are. This is the great thing about being a moderator, you get to upset everyone. Okay.
Okay, so I'm from New South Wales, and I only joined the Labor Party probably 2 months ago because my 16-year-old is really keen on Labor and climate action. But the thing I'm finding really confusing is this concept of Broadchurch, bringing all the grassroots along. I work in government and I've worked under both stripes as a policy writer, and I really think, great, have the Broadchurch, but you need the discipline and the simple message to sell, and who's going to decide that, and how quickly will it be decided? We are so close. Surely the platform has to be pulled together now, and the narrative has to be really, really controlled in terms of the language that's used. For most of the parts of Western Sydney where I'm writing land release policy, I can tell you they all consider themselves aspirational. Working class is almost like kryptonite to those people. It's a different language for different states, for sure, in different regions, but somehow there has to be, I take what Rebecca said, some sort of discipline in the language and some sort of control over the narrative and bringing along the Broadchurch. And I don't know how you get there because we haven't got that much time.
So, look, I'm actually a supporter of the idea that Labor Party elected representatives have more leeway on policy issues. Now, I know that goes against over 100 years of Labor Party orthodoxy, where our representatives are very much, bound by members, but it goes back to my earlier point about Australia being a really diverse country, right? So Jenny Hill, who's the Mayor of Townsville, is in the other room speaking at the moment, and Jenny is a magnificent mayor, and I can't speak highly enough of her. But she represents quite a different constituency there in regional Queensland to the one I do in central Melbourne. So you've got to give Jenny and me a little bit of flex there to represent the communities or speak for the communities that we represent. So in some ways, I actually think that we need to allow a little bit more diversity in terms of some of the things that people hear Labor representatives saying. Having said that, I do think it's also very important that we have the big ideas and the unifying policies that can bring large numbers of people together. And as I said, I'll go back to that Victorian case study and the Danish case study as well.
Okay, down the back, then I'm going to come to you.
Yeah,
Yep.
okay.
Big voice.
Do you want me to stand up?
Why not?
For me, one of the things, the takeaways that I took from the election is that people will always be frightened for their own family and family security. And no matter how good the policy is, if my livelihood and my family is threatened, as you said, you vote against your own interest because your perception is, I'm protecting my family here and now. And I'm just wondering, and on that basis, that if the difficulty is to sell for the government, and as you said, things, what is it? Politicians get in the road of good policy.
Not politicians, politics.
Sorry?
It's cutting close to the bone there.
Do economists, and here's my question really, do economists frustrate the politicians to be able to produce good policy? And are the economists frustrated with how we define how our society functions and how our politicians to provide the money to provide policy?
So shorter question is, how much do we love economists? Who wants to answer that? No, but actually I might... Sorry, did you want to answer that?
I reckon you should have a go at that one,
Yeah, you can do it.
And
I'm the moderator. I've outsourced my role. Rebecca, I'll jump in, but...
In Tasmania, the Tasmanian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the Tasmanian Council of Social Services have just released their fourth Tasmania report, when they engage an economist to do an analysis of what's going on in Tasmania. And it's actually the first year that it's been useful to us, I have to say, as a Labor movement in Tassie, because it's identified a whole bunch of areas where the government's failing. Even though the economy is performing well, they've failed when it comes to housing, health, education, general well-being. And that was picked up by this economic analysis. So I think sometimes the purists in economic analysis can be challenging for us, because it's about selling off public assets and more tax cuts and really undermining the sort of society that we would like to see. But there are also opportunities that come from having that independent analysis, depending on what they're measuring, that can give credibility for our ambitions and our aims from a policy perspective. So I don't think it's all frustrating. I think it is largely, it's a challenge for Labor to overcome that perception that we're not good economic managers, which is just rubbish, because if you look back at, the national economy or at the Tasmanian state economy, you can see how much of a lie that is and how it's been managed by different stripes of government. But I think there is a shift, and we heard from an economist just before in the lecture that was held in the theatre, but also what's happening across the globe, turning away from GDP as a sole measure of the prosperity of a place and looking at some of those other measures. So if economists start to shift their thinking like that, that will help the Labor movement, I think.
Now, very last question, and then we've got to wrap up.
Multiple people have sort of mentioned that, our policies are really good, but this magic trick that the Liberals always seem to pull is getting people to vote against their own economic interests. I guess, how can we get as good as them in terms of media or communication? And is it also to do with, the ways we're communicating people, the mediums we're using? How can Labor fix that and improve on that to make sure we're able to neutralise that effect and make sure that we're better in substance and also in communication form?
Yeah.
Can I just say that the playbook is exactly the same? Sorry.
Can we get the question?
Oh, sorry.
The question was how to improve the way in which we communicate with a large number of people, and in terms of outgunning Liberals in the way that politics is being done.
And if our policies are better, why do we keep
And if the
losing?
policies are better, why do Apologies.
It's just an observation that I was going to make was that the playbook is the same around the world, and you were talking about the Danes earlier, and we had the electric car things, Labor's going to take your utes. The Danes had exactly the same thing. The farmers were told that the Labor Party was going to take their trucks. It was exactly the same story, and it was propagated the same way. I mean, you can't keep getting away with that stuff. You can't. We know it now. We're awake to it. You know, the country's awake to it. They know that they were bluffed by the Clive Palmer campaign. I mean, I watched one of those ads. It was 2 minutes and 34 seconds on Tasmanian TV every night. I stood there and I didn't actually know what it meant. I didn't know what the story was. It was just telling me that everybody else was bad, and it was like, you must vote for Clive Palmer, who was running in every seat. It was absurd. 2 minutes and 34 seconds to drill into somebody that, you vote for us. I mean, there's the money behind that, obviously, but there's strategies. We can overcome this. We've just got to be very, very clear. We've got to be committed to it and make sure we get there.
Terrific.
Yeah.
And on that note, thank you very much again to everyone here. Please, round of applause for our panellists. This is obviously part of an ongoing dialogue, but it's important that we keep listening and talking. So thank you again for your attendance and participation today.